The auctioneer's gavel hit wood like a gunshot. "Sold! To the woman in the back. $43. Laughter rippled through the crowd. Harsh, ugly laughter that didn't even try to hide itself. Eliza Thorne stood perfectly still near the back wall of the Red Hollow Town Hall, her fingers clutching a small cloth purse that now held nothing but lint and broken threads. Every coin she'd saved over 6 years. Gone. For a building everyone knew was worthless. "Well, I'll be damned," someone muttered loud enough for half the room to hear. "The Thorne girl actually did it." "Bought herself a pile of ashes," another voice added. "That place has been dead longer than my marriage." More laughter. Eliza didn't look at them. She kept her eyes forward on the auctioneer's tired face, waiting for him to finish the paperwork that would make the nightmare officially hers. The building in question sat 3 blocks down on Porter Street, a burned-out husk that used to be the Silver Bell Saloon before a fire gutted it 2 years ago. The owner had died in the blaze. His widow left town the same week. Since then, the structure had slouched there like a rotting tooth, its blackened beams exposed to weather, its floor collapsed in places, its roof half gone. Nobody wanted it. The town had tried to auction it off twice before with no bidders at all. Until today. Until Eliza decided she'd had enough of being nothing. She signed the deed with a hand that didn't shake, not because she was confident, but because she'd already spent every drop of fear she had just working up the nerve to walk into this room. The auctioneer slid the paper across the table to her without meeting her eyes. He looked embarrassed. For her. "Good luck, Miss Thorne," he said quietly. She took the deed, folded it once, and tucked it inside her coat. Then she turned and walked toward the door. The crowd parted for her like she carried something contagious. She could feel their stares pressing into her back, judging, dismissing, already writing her off as the punchline to a joke they'd tell over drinks tonight. Let them. Outside, the November air bit at her face. The sky was low and gray, heavy with the promise of snow. Red Hollow stretched out before her in all its sagging, fading glory. A frontier town that had missed its chance at greatness and now limped along on stubborn habit. Half the building stood empty. The train came through twice a week if they were lucky. People left more often than they arrived. Eliza pulled her coat tighter and started walking toward Porter Street. She didn't have a plan. Not a real one. She had a building she couldn't afford to fix and no idea how to fix it even if she could. She had no family, no friends who'd stand with her, no skills beyond washing laundry and serving tables at the boarding house where she'd worked since she was 15. She had a dead father who'd drunk himself into the ground and a mother who'd died bringing her into the world, 2 legacies that had followed her like shadows her entire life. What she did have was rage. Not the hot, screaming kind, the cold kind, the kind that had been building for years every time someone looked past her like she was furniture, every time a man spoke over her like she hadn't said a word, every time she'd been paid half what she was worth, because that's just how things were for women like her. Women with no prospects, no protection, no value. She was 24 years old and she'd spent every single one of those years being invisible. Not anymore. The Silver Bell came into view as she rounded the corner onto Porter Street. In daylight, it looked worse than she remembered. The front door hung crooked on one hinge. The windows were just empty frames now, the glass long since scavenged or shattered. Inside, she could see charred beams stabbing up through piles of debris like broken ribs. Someone had painted a message on the remaining section of the front wall in crude white letters. Cursed. Eliza stopped in front of it and stared. A voice came from behind her. "You really buy this dump?" She turned. A man stood there, older, maybe 50, with a face like weathered leather and eyes that had seen too much. She recognized him vaguely. He ran the general store, or used to. She couldn't remember his name. "I did," she said. He shook his head slowly. "You know, Tom Farrell died in there, right? Burned alive. Some folks say you can still hear him screaming at night. Some folks say a lot of things." The man grunted. "Your funeral." He started to walk away, then paused and looked back. "You got any money left? For materials, I mean. Lumber, nails, that sort of thing." "No." "Didn't think so." He studied her for a moment, something almost like pity crossing his face. "You got family? Anyone who can help?" "No." Another grunt. "Well, like I said, your funeral." He left. Eliza stood alone on the empty street, staring at the ruin she now owned. The wind picked up, rattling loose boards somewhere inside the structure. It sounded like bones shaking. She walked up to the crooked door and pushed it open. The smell hit her first, charcoal, rot, and something else. Something sour and old. The floor creaked under her weight, sagging in places where the supports had burned through. She stepped carefully, testing each board before putting her full weight down. The main room was a disaster. The bar was a charred skeleton. Tables and chairs lay in pieces, some fused together by melted metal fittings. The back wall had partially collapsed, exposing the alley behind the building. Above her, daylight showed through gaps in the roof. Eliza stood in the center of the wreckage and turned slowly, taking it all in. This was hers now. All of it. The impossible weight of that fact settled onto her shoulders like a yoke. She'd spent $43, everything she had, on a burned-out shell that would take hundreds to repair, maybe thousands. She had no way to do the work herself and no money to hire anyone else. Winter was coming. She had rent due at the boarding house in 2 weeks, and now she couldn't pay it. She'd just made the stupidest decision of her life, and she'd do it again, because for the first time since she could remember, something belonged to her. Not to a man, not to an employer, not to the town or fate or bad luck. To her. She walked to what remained of the bar and ran her hand along the charred surface. Splinters bit into her palm. She didn't pull away. "All right," she said out loud to the empty room. "Let's see what you've got." The first week was reconnaissance. Eliza spent every spare hour she had walking through the building, making lists in her head of what needed to be done. The roof, the floor, the walls, the door, the windows. Everything. She borrowed a hammer and crowbar from the boarding house. Mrs. Talbot, her landlady, didn't ask why, and started pulling out the worst of the debris. Charred boards, broken glass, rusted metal fittings that had melted into twisted shapes. She piled it all in the alley behind the building, working until her hands blistered and her back screamed. People walked past sometimes. They'd slow down, watch her for a moment, then move on without saying anything. A few laughed. One man made a comment about her backside that she pretended not to hear. She kept working. By the end of the week, she'd cleared most of the main room. The floor was still dangerous, the roof still leaked, and the whole place still smelled like death. But at least you could walk through it without tripping over rubble. It was something. On the 8th day, she showed up to find someone had dumped a dead dog in the alley on top of her debris pile. Eliza stood there staring at it. A mangy thing, stiff with rigor mortis, its tongue hanging out between yellow teeth. Someone's idea of a joke. Or a message. She wrapped it in an old tarp, dragged it to the edge of town, and buried it in a shallow grave. Then she went back and kept working. That night, lying in her narrow bed at the boarding house, she counted what she had left. $3.18. Enough for maybe 2 weeks of food if she was careful, not enough for lumber, not enough for nails, not enough for anything that mattered. She stared at the ceiling and did the math over and over, trying to find a way to make it work. There wasn't one. Mrs. Talbot cornered her in the hallway the next morning. "You're behind on rent," the landlady said without preamble. She was a thick woman with iron gray hair and a face that looked like it had never smiled in its life. 2 weeks now. "I know," Eliza said. "I'll have it soon." "When soon?" "End of the month." Mrs. Talbot's eyes narrowed. "You spent your savings on that burned-out trash heap, didn't you?" Eliza didn't answer. "Lord help me, girl. You've got no sense at all. That place is cursed. Everyone knows it. Tom Farrell's widow tried to sell it for a year and couldn't give it away. Now you think you're going to do what with it? Open a saloon? You? Not a saloon. Then what?" Eliza met her eyes. "I don't know yet." Mrs. Talbot made a sound of disgust. "You don't know? That's just perfect. Well, let me tell you what I know. You don't have rent by the end of this week. You're out. I don't care if you've got nowhere to go. I run a business, not a charity." "I understand. Do you?" Mrs. Talbot stepped closer, her voice dropping. "You're not special, Eliza. You're not brave. You're just stupid. And stupid gets you frozen to death in a ditch come January. You'd be smarter to pack up whatever foolish dream you've got rattling around in that head and leave town while you still can." Eliza said nothing. Mrs. Talbot waited like she expected an argument. When none came, she snorted and walked away. Eliza stood in the hallway for a long moment, her hands curled into fists at her sides. Then she went to work. She started scavenging. There was a collapsed barn 2 miles outside of town that had been sitting abandoned for years. Eliza walked out there in the early morning cold and spent the day pulling boards free, testing each one for rot, stacking the good ones in a pile. By sunset, she had maybe 20 usable planks. She tied them into a bundle with rope and dragged them back to town, her shoulders burning, her breath coming in ragged gasps. It took her 3 trips to get them all back to the Silver Bell. The next day, she did it again. Different barn, same process, more boards, more rope burns, more splinters. People started to notice. "Girl's lost her mind," she heard someone say as she dragged a bundle of wood past the general store. "Always was a bit off," someone else replied. She kept walking. On the 3rd day, she found a half-collapsed shed behind an old church at the edge of town. The boards were better quality, real pine, not the rough-cut cottonwood from the barns. She worked fast, trying to get as much as she could before someone told her to stop. She was prying up a floor plank when a voice spoke behind her. "You're trespassing." Eliza froze. She turned slowly. A man stood in the doorway of the shed, tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair going gray at the temples, and a face that looked like it had been carved out of stone. He wore work clothes, and his hands were scarred from years of labor. She didn't recognize him. "I'm sorry," she said carefully. "I thought this place was abandoned." "It is." He stepped closer, looking at the pile of boards she'd already pulled up. "Doesn't mean you can just take what you want. I wasn't—" She stopped. Lying wouldn't help. "I need materials. I'm trying to rebuild the old Silver Bell on Porter Street." The man's expression didn't change. "That place burned down." "I know, I bought it." Now something shifted in his face, not quite surprised, but close. "You're the one who bought that death trap?" "Yes." He looked her up and down, taking in her worn dress, her blistered hands, the dirt on her face. "Why?" The question caught her off guard, not because she didn't have an answer, but because nobody had bothered to ask before. "Because it was there," she said finally, "and I could afford it." The man was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You know it's going to take a lot more than scavenged boards to make that place safe, right? The whole structure's compromised, roof, floor, foundation, all of it." "I know." "And you've got no money." It wasn't a question. She answered anyway. "No." "No crew." "No." "No experience." "No." He shook his head slowly. "So you're just going to do it yourself? With whatever scraps you can drag back from abandoned buildings?" Eliza straightened up, meeting his eyes. "Yes." The man studied her for a long moment. Then he did something she didn't expect. He smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the kind of smile someone gave when they recognized something familiar, something they'd seen before in themselves. "What's your name?" he asked. "Eliza Thorne." "Rowan Cade." He looked at the boards again, then back at her. "You remember your father, Eliza?" The question hit her like a punch. "He's dead." "I know. I asked if you remember him." "No, he died when I was young." Rowan nodded slowly. "He was a drunk and a fool, but he did me a kindness once, long time ago. I told him if he ever needed help, I'd pay it back." He paused. "I figure the debt passes to you." Eliza stared at him. "I don't need charity." "Good. Because I'm not offering it. I'm offering labor. You want help rebuilding that wreck? I'll give you a month of work. After that, we're square." "Why would you do that?" "Because I said I would." Rowan started walking toward the pile of boards. "Now grab the other end of these. If we're going to do this, we might as well do it right." Eliza didn't move. "I can't pay you." "I know. I can barely feed myself." "We'll figure it out." "You don't even know me." Rowan stopped and turned back to her. His face was hard, but his eyes weren't unkind. "No, but I knew your father, and I keep my word." He bent down and picked up one end of the board pile. "You coming or not?" Eliza hesitated for only a second. Then she grabbed the other end. Rowan Cade worked like a machine. He showed up at the Silver Bell every morning just after dawn, carrying tools Eliza had never seen before, levels, planes, saws with teeth so sharp they could cut through pine like butter. He didn't talk much. He'd assess what needed doing, explain it once in plain terms, then get to work. The first thing he did was shore up the floor. "You walk on this as it is, you're going to fall through and break your neck," he said, pointing at the sagging boards. "We need to replace the joists underneath before we do anything else." They spent 2 days crawling through the crawl space beneath the building, pulling out burned supports and fitting new ones into place. The work was brutal. Tight spaces, splinters, nails that bent instead of driving straight. Eliza's hands bled. Her knees turned purple with bruises. She didn't complain. Rowan noticed. He didn't say anything, but she caught him watching her sometimes with an expression she couldn't quite read. By the end of the first week, the floor was solid enough to walk on without fear. Rowan moved on to the roof next. "We're not replacing the whole thing," he said. "Can't afford it, but we can patch the worst holes and keep the rain out." They climbed up on ladders Rowan had borrowed from somewhere, Eliza didn't ask, and spent 3 days hammering down new shingles over the gaps. The wind up there was vicious, cutting through Eliza's coat like it wasn't even there. Her fingers went numb. She dropped nails, lost her balance twice, nearly slid off the edge once when a board gave way under her foot. Rowan caught her by the arm and hauled her back up. "Careful," was all he said. She nodded, heart hammering, and went back to work. People noticed. The first few days they just stared. Then they started talking. Eliza heard bits and pieces when she walked to the general store for supplies. Whispers, speculation, judgment. "Who's that man working with the Thorn girl?" "Rowan Cade. Used to live here years back." "What's he doing helping her?" "No idea. Maybe he's sweet on her." "Her? Not likely." Eliza ignored it. She had bigger problems. Money, for one. She was down to her last dollar. Rent was due in 3 days and she had nothing. Mrs. Talbot had made it clear there'd be no extensions. Eliza had been eating 1 meal a day, usually just bread and whatever vegetables she could afford, and even that was running out. She didn't tell Rowan. He had his own life, his own concerns. This was her problem. On the night before rent was due, she lay awake trying to figure out what to do. She could sell something, but she didn't own anything worth selling. She could try to find work, but she'd already been let go from the boarding house when Mrs. Talbot found out about the Silver Bell. Apparently helping herself was proof she didn't need the job anymore. There was no good answer. The next morning, she walked to the Silver Bell expecting to find Rowan already there. Instead, she found him standing outside talking to Mrs. Talbot. Eliza's stomach dropped. She approached slowly, trying to hear what they were saying. "Not my concern what you think she can or can't do," Mrs. Talbot was saying, her voice sharp. "She owes me money and she doesn't have it. That's the end of it." "How much?" Rowan asked. $8. "I'll cover it." Eliza stepped forward. "No." Both of them turned. "No," Eliza said again, looking at Rowan. "You're not paying my debts." "It's not a debt," Rowan said calmly. "It's an advance. You'll pay me back when the building's done and you're making money." "I can't." "Yes, you can." His voice was firm but not harsh. "Take the help, Eliza. Pride's a luxury you can't afford right now." Mrs. Talbot looked between them, her expression sour. "I don't care where the money comes from as long as I get it." Rowan pulled a small leather pouch from his coat and counted out $8 into Mrs. Talbot's waiting hand. She took it without a word and left. Eliza stood there, anger and shame warring in her chest. "I didn't ask you to do that," she said quietly. "I know. I don't want to owe you." "You don't owe me anything. We had a deal. 1 month of work, that's all." "This isn't part of the deal." Rowan looked at her steadily. "Maybe not. But if you're homeless, you can't work. And if you can't work, I can't keep my word to your father. So consider it practical, not charity." Eliza wanted to argue. She wanted to throw the money back in his face and tell him she didn't need anyone's help. But the truth was, she did. And he was right. Pride was a luxury she couldn't afford. "Thank you," she said finally. Rowan nodded once. "Let's get to work." The transformation was slow, but it was real. By the end of the second week, the Silver Bell had walls again. Not perfect walls. Some of the boards were mismatched. Some of the gaps were filled with whatever materials they could scavenge. But walls that held. Rowan worked on the structural repairs while Eliza focused on clearing and cleaning. She swept out years of ash and debris, scrubbed the charred beams until her arms ached, washed the windows that Rowan had managed to fit with salvaged glass. The building started to look less like a corpse and more like a possibility. One afternoon, as they were working on replacing a section of the back wall, Rowan spoke suddenly. "You ever going to tell me what you're planning to do with this place?" Eliza looked up from the board she was sanding. "What do you mean?" "I mean, we're rebuilding it, but for what? You said not a saloon. So what?" She'd been thinking about that question for weeks. The truth was, she still didn't have a perfect answer, but she had an idea. "A dining house," she said. Rowan raised an eyebrow. "A restaurant?" "Not exactly. More like a place where people can come for a decent meal. Something simple, honest, affordable." "You know how to cook?" "I can learn." Rowan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "There's already a boarding house that serves food, and the hotel has a dining room." "I know, but Mrs. Talbot charges too much, and the hotel's for rich people passing through. I'm talking about something different, for the people who actually live here." "The people who live here are broke. So am I." Eliza set down the sandpaper and looked at him. "That's the point. I'm not trying to get rich. I'm trying to build something that matters." Rowan studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. "All right. All right. All right. A dining house." He picked up his hammer. "Then we're going to need a kitchen, and tables, and a stove." Eliza's heart sank. "I don't have money for any of that." "I know a guy who might." Rowan drove a nail into the board with 3 sharp strikes. "Leave it to me." 2 days later, Rowan showed up with a wagon full of equipment. There was a cast iron stove, old but functional, a set of mismatched tables and chairs that looked like they'd been pulled from a dozen different places, pots, pans, utensils, dishes. Not enough for a full operation, but enough to start. "Where did you get all this?" Eliza asked, staring at the pile. "Called in some favors." Rowan started unloading the stove. "Don't ask questions." They spent the next week installing the stove, setting up the tables, organizing the kitchen space. Eliza scrubbed every dish, polished every pot, arranged and rearranged the tables until they felt right. It was starting to look like a real place. And then the first snow came. It started in the evening, light flakes that drifted down like ash. By morning, the ground was covered. By afternoon, it was coming down in thick sheets, piling up against the buildings, turning the streets into white rivers. Winter had arrived, and Eliza wasn't ready. She stood at the window of the Silver Bell watching the snowfall and felt the weight of everything pressing down on her. The building still needed work. She had no customers, no reputation, no money to buy food to serve, even if customers did show up. She was behind on the debt to Rowan. She had maybe 2 weeks of personal food left. The cold seeped through the walls, reminding her that the building had no heat beyond the stove, which she couldn't afford to keep running all day. "We're not going to make it," she said out loud. Rowan was working on fixing a wobbly table leg. He didn't look up. "Yes, we will." "How? We don't even have enough to open." "Then we'll open with what we have." He set down his tools and walked over to stand beside her. "You wanted to build something that matters, right?" "Yes." "Then stop waiting for it to be perfect. Perfect never happens. You open the doors, you serve what you can, and you figure the rest out as you go." Eliza looked at him. "What if nobody comes?" "Then nobody comes, but at least you tried." She turned back to the window. The snow was getting heavier. "When?" she asked. "Tomorrow," Rowan said. "We open tomorrow." Eliza's breath caught. "That's too soon." "It's never the right time. You know that." He was right. She did know that. She'd been waiting her whole life for the right time, and it had never come. Maybe it never would. "Okay," she said. "Tomorrow." They worked through the night. Eliza cooked everything she knew how to make with what little she had. A pot of bean soup, a pan of cornbread, a simple stew made from vegetables she'd bought days ago. It wasn't much. It wasn't fancy. But it was warm, and it was real. Rowan built a sign. He didn't ask her what to call the place. He just carved the words into a piece of wood he'd planed smooth and hung it above the door. Thorne's Simple. Direct. Hers. By dawn, everything was as ready as it was going to be. Eliza stood in the main room, looking at the tables she'd arranged, the kitchen she'd scrubbed, the sign hanging outside. Her hands were shaking. You nervous? Rowan asked. Terrified, she admitted. He nodded. Good. Means it matters. At 8 o'clock, Eliza unlocked the front door and pushed it open. The street outside was empty. Snow covered everything. The town was quiet. She waited. An hour passed, then another. Nobody came. Eliza tried not to let it crush her. She'd known this might happen. People didn't trust her. They thought she was a joke. Why would they come to a dining house run by a woman they'd spent years dismissing? But it still hurt. She was about to close the door when she saw movement down the street. A figure approached through the snow. A man, hunched against the cold, moving slowly. He stopped in front of Thorns and looked up at the sign. Then he looked at Eliza. You open? He asked. Yes, she said. He stepped inside. It was the man from the general store, the one who told her the building was cursed. He looked older in the light, more worn down. How much for the soup? He asked. 10 cents, Eliza said. Includes bread. He pulled out a dime and set it on the counter. Eliza served him a bowl of soup and a piece of cornbread. He sat at one of the tables and ate in silence. When he was done, he stood, nodded once at Eliza, and left without a word. But he'd been there. One customer, one meal. It was a start. By the end of the day, 3 more people had come. Not many, but more than none. Eliza stood in the kitchen that night, counting the coins she'd made. 40 cents total. Not enough to cover what she'd spent on ingredients, not even close. But it was something. Rowan appeared in the doorway. Not bad for the first day. We lost money, Eliza said. We'll make it back. How? He smiled, a real smile this time, not the hard one from before. Same way you bought this place, one impossible choice at a time. Eliza looked down at the coins in her hand. 40 cents. It wasn't much, but it was hers. And tomorrow, she'd do it again. The second week was worse than the first. Eliza opened the doors every morning at 8 and stood behind the counter, waiting. Some days, 2 people came, some days 5. One day, nobody came at all. She'd made soup that morning, enough for 20 people, and by evening she was eating it herself, alone at one of the tables, trying not to think about the waste. The math wasn't working. She was spending more on ingredients than she was taking in. The gap widened every day. She'd started keeping a ledger, writing down every penny spent and earned in careful columns, and the numbers told a story she didn't want to read. At this rate, she'd be out of money in 3 weeks. Rowan saw the ledger one afternoon when she left it open on the counter. He didn't say anything, but his jaw tightened. That night he stayed late, working on a section of wall that didn't really need fixing. You don't have to keep coming, Eliza said quietly. Your month is almost up. I know. So why are you still here? Rowan set down his hammer and looked at her. Because the job's not done. The building's done enough. You kept your word. I'm not talking about the building. Eliza didn't know what to say to that. She turned back to scrubbing the counter. She'd scrubbed it 3 times already today, but her hands needed something to do. Rowan picked up his tools. I'll see you tomorrow. He left before she could argue. The next morning, a woman Eliza had never seen before walked in just after opening. She was middle-aged, thin, with a baby wrapped against her chest in a worn shawl. She stood in the doorway like she wasn't sure she was allowed to be there. Are you open? She asked. Yes, Eliza said. Come in. The woman stepped inside, looking around nervously. I heard you serve food. Is that true? It is. Soup today. Bean and ham. 10 cents for a bowl and bread. The woman's face fell. I don't have 10 cents. Eliza hesitated. This was the moment where business sense said to turn her away. You couldn't run a dining house on charity. You couldn't feed people for free and expect to survive. But she looked at the baby, its face red and pinched with cold, and heard herself say, How much do you have? 3 cents. The woman's voice was barely a whisper. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have. 3 cents is fine, Eliza said. Sit down. The woman blinked. What? Sit down. I'll bring you soup. But, please, you look frozen. The woman sat slowly, like the chair might disappear beneath her. Eliza ladled out a generous bowl of soup, added 2 pieces of bread instead of 1, and brought it to the table. The woman stared at it. I can only pay 3 cents, she said again. I know. It's enough. The woman's eyes filled with tears. She set the 3 pennies on the table with shaking hands, then picked up the spoon and started eating. She ate like someone who hadn't had a real meal in days, fast, desperate, barely stopping to breathe. Eliza turned away to give her privacy. When the woman finished, she stood and came to the counter. "Thank you," she said. "I don't... Thank you." "You're welcome. What's your name?" "Sarah. Sarah Brennan. Come back tomorrow if you need to, Sarah. We'll figure something out." Sarah nodded, tears still wet on her cheeks, and left with the baby clutched tight against her. Eliza picked up the 3 pennies and added them to the till. 7 cents loss on that meal. 7 cents she couldn't afford. But when she closed her eyes that night, she didn't see numbers. She saw Sarah's face, the gratitude, the relief. It didn't pay the bills, but it meant something. Sarah came back the next day, and the day after that. Each time she had a few cents, never enough for the full price, but Eliza took whatever she offered and served her anyway. Other people started to notice. One afternoon, a man came in, rough-looking, with calloused hands and dirt under his nails. He ordered soup, ate it, then pulled out a dime. "That woman who comes in here," he said, "the one with the baby, she your friend?" "No," Eliza said carefully, "just a customer." "You're feeding her for less than cost." It wasn't a question. Eliza didn't deny it. The man studied her for a moment, then set down 2 dimes instead of 1. "The extra's for her," he said. "Next time she comes in, use it." Eliza stared at the coins. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to. I'm doing it anyway." He stood and walked to the door, then paused. "You're all right, Miss Thorne. Don't let anyone tell you different." He left. Eliza stood there holding the extra dime, something tight and warm spreading in her chest. Word spread in strange ways in a small town. By the end of the week, more people were coming in. Not crowds, nothing like that, but a steady trickle. They'd order soup, eat quietly, and sometimes they'd leave a little extra. A few pennies on the table. A nickel under a plate. They never said why. They didn't have to. Eliza started keeping a jar behind the counter. When someone came in who clearly couldn't afford the full price, she'd check the jar first. Sometimes there was enough to cover the difference. Sometimes there wasn't. She served them anyway. Rowan noticed the jar one evening. He picked it up, shook it gently to hear the coins rattle, then set it back down. "People are helping," he said. "A little. More than a little." He looked at her. "You're building something here. You know that, right?" Eliza shook her head. "I'm barely keeping the doors open." "That's not what I meant." She wanted to believe him, but the ledger told a different story. Despite the occasional generosity, despite the slow increase in customers, she was still losing money. Not as fast as before, but steadily. The gap was closing, but not fast enough. Winter deepened. The temperature dropped. Snow fell almost every other day now, piling up in drifts against the buildings. The town pulled inward, everyone hoarding heat and resources, preparing for the worst of it. Eliza burned through her firewood faster than she'd planned. The stove needed to stay lit to keep the dining room warm enough for customers, and she couldn't afford to let it go cold. She started rationing, letting the fire die down at night, huddling under every blanket she owned in the small room she'd made for herself in the back of the building. She'd stopped paying rent at the boarding house. There was no point. She'd moved everything she owned, which wasn't much, into the Silver Bell. Mrs. Talbot had made her opinions clear about that decision. "You'll freeze to death in that place," the landlady had said with something that might have been concern or might have been satisfaction. Mark my words. Maybe she was right. Some mornings, Eliza woke to ice on the inside of the windows, her breath visible in the air. She'd drag herself out of bed, light the stove, and stand next to it until feeling returned to her fingers. Then she'd start cooking. Rowan brought firewood one morning, just showed up with a wagon full of split logs and started stacking them against the back wall. "Where did you get this?" Eliza asked. "Does it matter?" "I can't pay you for it." "Good thing I'm not asking you to." He kept stacking. "You need heat. This is heat. End of discussion." Eliza watched him work, gratitude and frustration tangled together in her throat. She hated needing help, hated that she couldn't do this alone, hated that every kindness felt like proof of her own inadequacy. But she needed the firewood. So she swallowed her pride and said, "Thank you." Rowan just nodded and kept working. That night, the first real storm hit. It started in the late afternoon, wind howling down the main street, snow coming in horizontal sheets. By evening, visibility was near zero. Eliza stood at the window watching it, her stomach tight with worry. Nobody would come out in this. The few customers she'd been counting on would stay home. She'd made stew for 20 people and she'd be lucky if she saw one. She was about to start closing up when the door banged open. 3 people stumbled in, a man, a woman, and a boy who couldn't have been more than 10. They were covered in snow, shaking with cold, their faces red and raw. "Please," the man gasped. "We need shelter, just for an hour, until the storm passes." Eliza moved quickly. "Sit, all of you, near the stove." They collapsed at the nearest table. The boy was crying quietly, his teeth chattering so hard Eliza could hear them across the room. She grabbed blankets from her room and wrapped them around the family, then ladled out 3 bowls of stew without asking if they wanted it. She set the bowls down with bread and hot coffee. "Eat," she said. "You need to warm up from the inside." The man looked at the food, then at her. "We can't pay." "I didn't ask you to." "But eat," Eliza said again, more firmly. "We'll worry about everything else after you're warm." The woman started crying. The man put his arm around her and they ate in silence while the storm raged outside. They stayed for 3 hours. By the time the wind died down enough for them to leave, the boy had fallen asleep wrapped in blankets by the stove. The man carried him, and the woman pressed a few coins into Eliza's hand on their way out. "It's not enough," she said, "but it's all we have." Eliza looked down. 4 cents. "It's enough," she said. After they left, she stood at the window watching them disappear into the snow. She was out 17 cents on that meal. 17 cents plus 3 hours of firewood. She should feel angry, frustrated, cheated. Instead, she felt something else entirely. She felt necessary. The storms kept coming. Some days the snow was so heavy that Eliza couldn't see across the street. The town slowed to a crawl. Businesses closed early. People stayed inside. The cold was brutal, relentless, grinding, and people kept coming to Thorns. Not in crowds, often just 1 or 2 at a time, stumbling in from the cold, desperate for warmth and food. Eliza served them all. She stopped checking the ledger. The numbers were bad and they were getting worse, but what was she supposed to do? Turn people away? Let them freeze? She couldn't do that. Rowan saw what was happening. He didn't say anything, but she'd catch him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read, something between admiration and concern. One evening, after the last customer had left, he spoke. "You're going to run out of money." Eliza was cleaning the counter. She didn't stop. "I know." "Soon." "I know." "What are you going to do?" She set down the rag and looked at him. "Keep going until I can't." "That's not a plan. It's the only one I have." Rowan was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "What if we change what you're doing?" "What do you mean?" "Right now you're trying to run a business, but you're not charging enough to cover costs, and you're feeding people who can't pay. That's not a business. That's charity." "I know that. So stop pretending it's a business. Make it official." Eliza frowned. "How?" "A ledger system. People pay what they can. If they can't pay today, they pay later. You keep track of who owes what. When times get better, they settle up." "What if times don't get better? What if they never pay?" "Then they don't pay, but at least you're being honest about what this is." Eliza thought about it. It made a certain kind of sense. She was already feeding people on credit whether she admitted it or not. The difference was she wasn't keeping track. This way, at least there'd be accountability. A promise, even if it was one that might never be kept. "All right," she said. "We'll try it." They spent that night creating a new system. Rowan built a simple wooden box with a slot in the top, a place where people could leave money if they had it. Eliza made a ledger specifically for credit, with columns for names, amounts owed, and amounts paid. The next morning, she put up a sign. "Pay what you can. If you can't pay today, you can pay later. Everyone eats." The reaction was immediate. Some people were suspicious. They'd come in, read the sign, and leave without ordering. They didn't trust it, didn't believe anyone would really operate that way. But others understood. Sarah Brennan came in that afternoon and stared at the sign for a full minute. Then she looked at Eliza. "You mean that?" she asked. "Everyone eats?" "I mean it." Sarah's eyes welled up. I've been skipping meals so the baby can have milk. I've been so hungry I can't sleep. Not anymore, Eliza said. Sit down. Sarah sat. Eliza brought her soup and bread and watched as the woman ate like she was trying to memorize the taste. When she finished, she came to the counter. I owe you $2.60, she said quietly, from all the times I came before. I've been keeping track. I know, I've been keeping track too. I'll pay you back. I swear. As soon as my husband finds work, I believe you, Eliza said. And she did. Sarah left with something that looked like hope on her face. Word spread faster this time. Within a week, the dining room was fuller than it had ever been. People came who'd been too proud to accept charity before because this wasn't charity. It was a promise, a contract. They owed a debt and they'd pay it back when they could. The ledger filled with names. $3 here, 50 cents there. Some entries were small, some were significant. Eliza wrote them all down carefully, never judging, never shaming. She was hemorrhaging money now. The jar of donations didn't come close to covering the deficit. The firewood was running low again. Her own supplies were nearly gone. But the dining room was warm, and people were eating. Rowan pulled her aside one night after closing. You've got maybe 2 weeks left, he said bluntly. Then you're out of everything. Money, food, firewood, everything. I know. Do you have a plan? Eliza looked at the ledger, pages and pages of debts that might never be paid. No. Eliza, I know, Rowan. I know it's stupid. I know it's not sustainable. But what am I supposed to do? Look at that ledger. Those are people, real people, who are hungry and cold and scared. If I close the doors, where do they go? That's not your responsibility. Then whose is it? She heard her voice rising and forced it back down. Everyone in this town looked at me like I was nothing, like I didn't matter. Now I have a chance to matter, to actually help people. And you're telling me to stop because the math doesn't work? Rowan's jaw tightened. I'm telling you to stop because you're going to destroy yourself trying to save everyone else. Maybe that's the point. Destroying yourself? Mattering. They stared at each other. The tension hung heavy between them. Finally, Rowan said, You're impossible. I know. He shook his head, but there was something in his eyes, not anger, but something closer to respect. Fine. You want to keep going? We keep going, but we do it smart. What does that mean? It means we find more resources. I've got some money saved, not much, but enough to buy you another few weeks. No, Eliza said immediately. I'm not taking your money. You already took my labor. What's the difference? The difference is... She stopped. What was the difference? Pride? That same pride she'd already swallowed a dozen times? The difference is nothing, Rowan finished for her. You need help. I'm offering it. Take it. Eliza wanted to argue. Every instinct screamed at her to refuse, to prove she could do this alone. But she couldn't do it alone. She'd never been able to do it alone. Okay, she said quietly. Okay. Rowan nodded. Good. Now let's figure out what else we can do. They worked late into the night, planning. They'd buy cheaper ingredients in bulk. They'd serve smaller portions but make them go further. They'd ask the customers who could pay to donate a little extra, not as pressure, but as invitation. They'd find more wood, more supplies, more anything they could scavenge or barter for. It wasn't a perfect plan. It probably wasn't even a good plan, but it was something. The next morning, Eliza added a second sign next to the first. If you can give a little extra, it helps feed someone who can't. That afternoon, an old man came in. He ordered soup, ate it slowly, then pulled out a silver dollar and set it on the counter. Soup's 10 cents, Eliza said. I know. The rest is for someone else. You don't have to... Young lady, the man interrupted, his voice rough but not unkind. I've lived in this town 40 years. I've seen people starve. I've seen families freeze to death in their homes. I've seen neighbors turn their backs on each other because everyone's too worried about their own survival to care about anyone else's. He tapped the silver dollar. What you're doing here. This matters. So take the damn money and feed someone. Eliza took the money. More people started doing the same. Not everyone. Not even most people. But enough that the jar behind the counter started to fill again. 10 cents extra here, a quarter there. One woman left half a ham with a note that said simply, for the soup. The donations didn't solve the problem. Eliza was still losing money every week, but they slowed the bleeding. They bought time, and time was all she needed. Winter tightened its grip. The storms came more frequently now, sometimes lasting days. The town became a white prison, streets impassable, supplies running low everywhere. The general stores started rationing flour and sugar. The hotels stopped serving dinner because they couldn't get enough food. But Thorne's stayed open. Eliza cooked with whatever she had. Some days it was thin soup made from bones and scraps. Some days it was bread and butter and nothing else. It didn't matter. People came because it was warm and because they knew they'd be fed. The dining room became more than a restaurant. It became a gathering place. People would come early and stay late, huddled around the stove, sharing news and rumors and fears. Eliza would move between the tables, refilling coffee, bringing more bread, listening to conversations about missing livestock and broken roofs, and children with coughs that wouldn't go away. She was running on fumes now, sleeping maybe 4 hours a night, eating scraps, burning through firewood so fast that Rowan had to make supply runs every other day. Her hands were perpetually cracked and bleeding from the cold and the work. Her back ached. Her feet hurt. She kept going. One night, a woman Eliza didn't recognize came in just before closing. She was older, well-dressed, clearly not from Red Hollow. "Are you Eliza Thorne?" the woman asked. "I am. My name is Margaret Wells. I run the hotel." She looked around the dining room, taking in the mismatched furniture, the worn floors, the people still lingering by the stove. "I wanted to see for myself what everyone's been talking about." Eliza tensed. The hotel was her competition, or would be if she were actually running a business. "What can I do for you?" Margaret smiled. "You can tell me how you're doing this. My dining room's been empty for 2 weeks. Nobody comes anymore. They all come here instead. I charge less." "It's not about the price. I've seen your sign. Half these people aren't paying anything at all." Margaret stepped closer. "So what is it? Why do they come here?" Eliza didn't have a good answer. She looked around the room, at Sarah Brennan nursing a cup of coffee while her baby slept against her chest, at the old man who'd given her the silver-dollar playing cards with 2 younger men, at a family she didn't know sharing a single bowl of soup among 4 people. "Because they need to," she said finally. Margaret studied her for a long moment. Then she reached into her coat and pulled out a small envelope. She set it on the counter. "What's this?" Eliza asked. "A donation, $50, for your operations." Eliza stared at the envelope like it might explode. "I don't understand." "You're doing something I couldn't figure out how to do," Margaret said. "You're feeding this town, keeping people alive. I've got money sitting in a bank doing nothing while people starve. That seems wrong." She pushed the envelope closer. "Take it. Use it. Keep doing what you're doing." "Why?" "Because someone should." Margaret turned to leave, then paused. "And because I suspect you're exactly the kind of stubborn fool who'll actually make this work." She left before Eliza could respond. Eliza stood there holding the envelope, her hands shaking. $50. $50 was enough to buy supplies for months, enough to keep the doors open through the worst of winter, enough to survive. She opened the envelope to make sure it was real. Inside were 5 $10 bills and a note in neat handwriting. "Don't let the bastards convince you this isn't possible." Eliza read it 3 times, then folded it carefully and put it in her pocket. That night, alone in her cold room, she finally let herself cry. Not from despair or fear or exhaustion, though she felt all of those things. From relief. Because, for the first time since she'd bought this cursed building, she believed she might actually survive. Margaret Wells's $50 bought Eliza 3 things: time, supplies, and hope. She spent it carefully, stretching every dollar as far as it would go. Flour in bulk, dried beans by the sack, salt pork that would last through the winter. She paid Rowan back some of what she owed him, though he argued against it. "Keep it," he'd said. "Use it for the dining room." "I'm using it to settle my debts," she'd replied. "Same as I expect everyone else to do." He'd taken the money without another word, but she'd caught something in his expression. Respect, maybe, or something close to it. The storms kept coming, but Thorne stayed warm. People arrived earlier now and stayed later, clustering around the tables even after they'd finished eating. The dining room had become something Eliza hadn't planned for, a refuge. Not just from hunger, but from isolation, from the crushing weight of winter and poverty and fear. She didn't mind. If anything, she encouraged it. She'd brew extra coffee and leave it on the stove. She'd put out checkerboards and decks of cards she'd found in the debris when she'd first started cleaning. People would play for hours, their voices filling the room with sound that felt like life. Rowan noticed the change too. "You're not running a dining house anymore," he said one evening after most people had left. "You're running a community hall." Eliza was scrubbing a pot that didn't really need scrubbing. "Is that a problem?" "Depends. You making any money off community?" "No." "Then yeah, it's a problem." She set down the pot and turned to face him. "I'm not trying to get rich, Rowan. I told you that from the beginning." "I know, but you still need to eat, still need to keep the lights on." He gestured around the room. "This place eats through resources like wildfire. You're going through Margaret's donation faster than you think." He was right. She knew he was right. The $50 had seemed like a fortune at first, but it was disappearing fast. She'd already spent half of it, and they weren't even through January yet. "What do you suggest?" she asked. Rowan leaned against the counter, thinking. "You need regular income, something steady. Right now, you're dependent on charity and people paying back debts that might never get paid." "So what? I start charging everyone full price? Turn away people who can't afford it?" "No, you expand." Eliza frowned. "Expand how?" "Rooms. You've got space upstairs that's not being used. Fix it up, rent it out to travelers. It won't be much, but it's something." "I don't have money to fix up rooms." "You've got labor." He pushed off the counter. "I'll help. We can do it cheap, same way we did the dining room. Scavenge materials, work with what we have." Eliza looked toward the stairs that led to the second floor. She hadn't been up there in weeks. The space was still gutted from the fire, worse than the main floor had been. Rooms with holes in the walls, floors that sagged, windows that didn't close. It would be a massive undertaking, but Rowan was right. She needed something steady, something that didn't depend on the kindness of strangers or the slow repayment of debts. "All right," she said. "Show me what we're working with." They went upstairs together, Rowan carrying a lantern. The second floor was as bad as Eliza remembered, maybe worse. There were 4 rooms total, all of them damaged. The hallway floor creaked ominously under their weight. Cold air whistled through gaps in the walls. Rowan walked through each room slowly, testing floorboards, checking walls, examining the ceiling. Eliza watched him work, noting the way he moved, methodical, careful, professional. She'd never asked what he did before he came back to Red Hollow. Now she wondered. "It's not hopeless," he said finally. 2 of these rooms are salvageable. We'd need to shore up the floors, patch the walls, get windows that actually close. Furniture would be minimal, just beds and basic pieces. "How long? A month? Maybe less if we work fast." "And the cost?" Rowan did some mental math. $30, give or take. Most of that's windows and mattresses. Everything else we can scavenge or build. $30. More than half of what she had left. But if it worked, if she could actually rent out rooms, it would pay for itself eventually. "Let's do it," she said. They started the next day. The work was brutal. The second floor was colder than the first, and there was no easy way to heat it while they worked. Eliza's fingers went numb within minutes of starting each morning. They'd work until they couldn't feel their hands anymore, then go downstairs to warm up by the stove before heading back up. Rowan handled the structural repairs, replacing rotted floorboards, reinforcing joists, framing out walls where the studs had burned through. Eliza focused on cleaning and preparation, scrubbing away soot and debris, pulling nails from salvaged boards, organizing materials. They worked in silence mostly. Sometimes Rowan would explain what he was doing, and Eliza would listen and learn. Sometimes she'd ask questions and he'd answer, but often they just worked side by side, the only sounds the rasp of saws and the tap of hammers. The dining room stayed open through it all. Eliza would work upstairs until mid-morning, then go down to start cooking. She'd serve lunch, clean up, then head back upstairs for a few more hours before it was time to prepare dinner. The days blurred together. Work, cook, serve, clean, sleep, repeat. She was exhausted all the time now, the kind of tired that settled into your bones and didn't leave. But there was something satisfying about it too. Every board they replaced, every wall they patched, was proof of progress. Visible, tangible proof that things could get better. People noticed the construction. Some were curious, asking what she was building. Others were skeptical. Rooms? One man said when she explained. Who's going to rent rooms in Red Hollow? Nobody comes through here anymore. They will, Eliza said with more confidence than she felt. You keep telling yourself that, sweetheart. She let it slide. She'd learned that arguing with skeptics was a waste of energy. Better to just prove them wrong. 3 weeks into the renovation, disaster struck. Eliza was working alone upstairs. Rowan had gone to pick up windows from a supplier 2 towns over when she heard shouting from downstairs. She dropped her tools and ran down to find smoke pouring from the kitchen. Her heart stopped. Fire. Again. The thing she'd feared most since buying this place. She grabbed a bucket of water she kept by the door and ran into the kitchen. Flames were climbing up the wall behind the stove, feeding on grease that had accumulated over weeks of cooking. She threw the water on the flames. They sputtered but didn't die. She ran for another bucket, filled it from the pump outside, ran back and threw it. The fire retreated but kept burning, stubborn and hungry. Someone ran in behind her, the old man who'd given her the silver dollar. "Get more water," she shouted. He didn't argue. He grabbed buckets and started pumping. Others appeared. Sarah Brennan, the man who'd left extra money for her, people whose names Eliza didn't even know. They formed a chain, passing buckets from the pump to the kitchen, dousing the flames over and over until finally, the fire went out. Eliza stood in the middle of the kitchen, soaking wet and shaking. The wall behind the stove was charred black. The smell of smoke was overwhelming. Water pooled on the floor, mixing with ash. But the fire was out. The building was still standing. "Everyone all right?" the old man asked. Murmurs of agreement. No one was hurt. Eliza sank down onto the floor, her legs giving out. She put her head in her hands and tried to breathe. This was too close. Too similar to what had happened before. If they'd been 5 minutes slower, if the fire had spread to the dining room, if the old wood had caught properly, the building would have burned again, and this time it would have been her fault. "Hey," Sarah Brennan knelt down beside her. "You're okay. We got it out." "I should have been more careful," Eliza said. "I should have cleaned the grease. I should have—" "Stop," Sarah said firmly. "It was an accident. Accidents happen. I almost burned the place down." "But you didn't." Sarah gripped her shoulder. "You put it out. We put it out. That's what matters." The old man spoke up from across the room. "You're going to need to rebuild that wall and clean out the stovepipe. Probably replace some of the floorboards here, too." Eliza looked up at the damage. More work, more money, more time she didn't have. "I know," she said quietly. "I can help," the man said. "Got some experience with this kind of thing." "Me too," another voice added. One of the younger men who'd been playing cards earlier. "I'm not much good with tools," Sarah said, "but I can clean. Help get the smoke smell out." Others offered too. Small things. Time, labor, materials they could spare. Nothing extravagant. But enough. Eliza looked around at the faces surrounding her. People she'd fed. People she'd helped. People who'd been strangers a few months ago. They were helping her now. "Thank you," she managed. The old man waved it off. "You fed us when we were hungry. Now we help you when you need it. That's how it works." They spent the rest of the day cleaning up the damage and making temporary repairs. By evening, the kitchen was functional again, though it looked rough. The wall would need proper rebuilding, but that could wait. When Rowan returned with the windows and saw the charred wall, his face went pale. "What happened?" Eliza explained. He listened without interrupting, his jaw tight. "You could have died," he said when she finished. "But I didn't." "Eliza, I know it was close. I know I need to be more careful." She met his eyes. "But we put it out. The building's still here, and people helped. That has to count for something." Rowan was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You're going to give me gray hair." Despite everything, Eliza almost smiled. "Pretty sure you already have gray hair. More gray hair." That night, after everyone had left and the dining room was dark, Eliza sat at one of the tables with her ledger. She'd started a new page for the fire damage, materials needed, labor costs, time required. The numbers weren't good, but they weren't impossible either. She added a note at the bottom. People who helped, and started listing names. The old man whose name she'd finally learned was Henry Sutton, Sarah Brennan, Jack Reeves, the young card player, others whose names she was still learning. A community, she thought. That's what Rowan had called it. Maybe he was right. The next morning she woke to find someone had left a stack of lumber on her doorstep. No note, no name, just wood, already cut to size for wall repair. She stared at it for a long time, something warm and tight growing in her chest. Then she got to work. The rooms upstairs came together faster after that. Word had spread about the fire and people started showing up to help. Not everyone, not even most people, but enough that the work moved quicker. Henry Sutton turned out to be a decent carpenter. He helped Rowan with the more technical repairs while Eliza focused on finishing work. Jack Reeves was useless with tools but strong, so they put him on hauling duty, carrying materials up and down the stairs, moving furniture, clearing debris. Sarah came by most days with her baby, cleaning and organizing while the men worked. She had an eye for detail that Eliza lacked, pointing out things that needed attention. Loose nails, rough edges, spots that needed extra sanding. By mid-February, the first room was finished. It wasn't fancy. The bed was a simple frame Rowan had built with a mattress they'd bought used from a family leaving town. The walls were patched and painted white. Cheap paint that didn't cover perfectly but looked clean enough. There was a small dresser, a chair, a washstand, a window that actually closed and locked. It was basic, functional, honest. Eliza stood in the doorway looking at it and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Pride. Not bad, Rowan said from behind her. It's perfect, she said. It's not perfect. Look at that corner, the paint's streaky, and the floorboards don't quite line up. It's perfect, Eliza repeated. Rowan smiled. Yeah, I guess it is. They finished the second room a week later. By the beginning of March, both rooms were ready to rent. Now came the hard part, finding renters. Eliza put up a sign outside. Rooms available, clean, quiet, affordable. The first day, no one came. The second day, a traveling salesman stopped by. He looked at the room, looked at Eliza, and asked how much. 50 cents a night, she said. Includes breakfast? The man laughed. The hotel charges 35 cents, and they've got better beds. The hotel's dining room is closed. Mine isn't. He considered that. What's breakfast? Whatever I'm making that morning, usually porridge or eggs, coffee, bread. 50 cents is steep. Then go to the hotel. The man studied her for a moment, then pulled out 2 quarters and set them on the counter. I'll take it for the night. We'll see if it's worth it. He stayed 3 nights. On the morning of the 4th day, he paid for another 2. Food's good, he said by way of explanation, and it's quiet. I can actually sleep here. Word started to spread, slowly, through the networks that traveling salesmen maintained. A room in Red Hollow that was clean and cheap and came with good food. Not luxurious, but reliable. More travelers came. Not a flood, but a trickle. Some stayed one night, some stayed several. Eliza kept the breakfast simple but filling. The same food she served in the dining room, just included in the room rate. The money helped. Not a lot, but enough to notice. She could buy better ingredients now, replace worn equipment, pay back more of what she owed Rowan and the others who'd helped with supplies. The ledger of debts was still long, pages of names and amounts that might never be fully repaid. But some people had started paying back small amounts. $1 here, 50 cents there. Progress. Spring started to show itself in small ways. The snow melted in patches, revealing muddy ground underneath. The temperature rose just enough that Eliza didn't have to keep the stove burning at full blast all day. Days got longer, and people's moods lifted. There was more laughter in the dining room now, more conversation. The desperate edge that had defined winter started to fade, replaced by something that felt almost like optimism. Eliza felt it too. For the first time since she'd bought this building, she could see a path forward. Not an easy path. Nothing about this was easy, but a possible one. The dining room covered its costs now, mostly. The rooms brought in steady income. She wasn't making a profit exactly, but she wasn't losing money as fast as before. It was working. And then the blizzard came. It hit on a Tuesday in late March, when everyone thought winter was finally done. The temperature dropped 30 degrees overnight. The wind picked up, howling like something alive. Snow started falling in the early afternoon and didn't stop. By evening, the drifts were 3 feet high. By morning, they were 6. The town shut down completely. Roads disappeared. Businesses closed. People barricaded themselves inside, burning through whatever fuel they had left, eating whatever food remained in their pantries. Eliza opened Thorne's anyway. She had fuel. She had food. Not a lot, but enough for a few days if she was careful. And she knew people would need it. They came in ones and twos throughout the day, pushing through snow that came up to their waists, cold, hungry, desperate. She served them soup made thin to stretch further, coffee, bread. By the second day, her supplies were running low. By the third day, they were critical. Rowan pulled her aside that afternoon. You need to ration more. Cut the portions in half. People are starving. And you'll starve too if you give away everything you have. I can't turn them away, Rowan. I'm not saying turn them away. I'm saying be smart about this. The storm's not breaking. We could be stuck like this for a week. Eliza looked around the dining room. Every table was full. People huddled around the stove, sharing blankets, sharing warmth. Children were crying. Adults looked hollow-eyed and afraid. I'll figure something out, she said. How? She didn't have an answer. That night, she took inventory of everything she had left. 2 pounds of flour, a small bag of beans, some coffee, a few potatoes, half a sack of oats, some salt pork that was more salt than pork at this point. It wasn't enough, not even close. She did the math 3 different ways, trying to make it work. No matter how she calculated it, she'd run out of food in 2 days. Maybe 3 if she stopped eating entirely herself. She sat at the kitchen table with her head in her hands, exhaustion and fear pressing down like physical weight. The door to the kitchen opened. Rowan stepped in, snow still clinging to his coat. I'm going hunting, he said. Eliza looked up. What? Hunting. There's deer in the hills east of town. Maybe elk if we're lucky. We need meat. You can't go out in this. You'll freeze to death. Probably, but if I don't go, we definitely run out of food. Those aren't great odds either way, but at least one option has a chance. Eliza stood up. Rowan, no. It's too dangerous. You got a better idea? She didn't. I didn't think so. He adjusted his coat. I'll take enough supplies for 3 days. If I'm not back by then... Don't, Eliza said sharply. Don't say it like that. Rowan's expression softened slightly. I'll come back. I always do. You don't know that. No, but I believe it. He moved toward the door, then paused. Keep feeding people. Don't ration unless you absolutely have to. I'll bring back enough to make it worth it. And if you don't come back? He looked at her for a long moment. Then you'll figure it out. You always do. He left before she could argue further. Eliza stood in the empty kitchen, staring at the door he'd just walked through. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows. Snow continued to fall. She wanted to run after him, tell him not to go, lock the door and keep him here where it was safe. But she didn't. Because he was right. They needed food, and she didn't have a better plan. That night, she barely slept. Every gust of wind made her think of Rowan out there somewhere in the darkness and cold. Every creak of the building made her imagine him frozen in a drift, calling for help that would never come. She got up before dawn and started cooking with what she had left. Thin porridge, weak coffee. It was something. People came throughout the day, fewer than before because the snow was so deep now that some couldn't make it through. Those who did arrive looked worse, thinner, colder, more desperate. Eliza served them all. By evening, she was down to the last of the oats and a handful of beans. The second day was worse. She made soup from bones she'd saved. Bones she'd planned to throw away but kept just in case. She boiled them for hours, extracting every bit of flavor and nutrition she could. The result was barely better than hot water, but it was warm, and people were grateful. Henry Sutton came in that afternoon and saw what she was serving. "This is all you have left?" he asked quietly. Eliza didn't see the point in lying. "Yes." "Where's Rowan?" "Hunting. He left 2 days ago." Henry's face darkened. "In this storm?" "We needed food." "You needed him alive more than you needed food." Eliza felt anger flare. "You think I don't know that? You think I wanted him to go? But what was I supposed to do? Let everyone starve?" Henry held up his hands. "I'm not blaming you. I'm just saying, That man cares about you more than you seem to realize. He's honoring a debt to my father. Is that what you think this is? Henry shook his head. Girl, you're smart about a lot of things, but you're blind about that. Liza didn't know what to say to that. She turned back to stirring the pot of bone broth, her face hot. The third day, she ran out of food entirely. She stood in the kitchen that morning staring at empty containers and bare shelves. There was nothing left. Nothing to serve, nothing to stretch, nothing to make something from nothing. People would come. They always came. And she'd have to turn them away. The thought made her physically ill. She was still standing there when Sarah Brennan appeared in the doorway. Eliza, people are gathering outside. They're bringing food. Eliza followed her to the front door and looked out. There were maybe 20 people standing in the snow. Each one held something, a jar of preserves, a small sack of flour, a few potatoes, a can of beans. Henry Sutton held a ham he must have been saving for himself. They were giving her their reserves, their emergency supplies, the food they'd been hoarding to survive the storm themselves. We heard you ran out, Henry said. Figured we could spare a bit. Pool our resources. Eliza couldn't speak. Her throat had closed up entirely. They filed in one by one, setting their contributions on the counter. Eliza watched them with tears streaming down her face, not even trying to hide it anymore. Why? She managed finally. Because you fed us when we had nothing, Sarah said simply. Now we feed you. They stayed to help. Sarah organized the donated food while Henry started a fire in the stove. Jack Reeves helped Eliza make soup from the combined ingredients, actual soup this time, with vegetables and ham and substance. By noon, they were serving food again. The dining room filled up. Word had spread that Thorns was open again, and people came through the snow to get there. Eliza moved through the room in a daze, serving food that had materialized from the collective sacrifice of people who barely had enough for themselves. This was what she'd built. Not a business. Not even really a dining house. A community. People who took care of each other because that's what people should do. Late that afternoon, as the light was starting to fade, the front door banged open. Rowan stumbled in, covered in snow and ice, dragging something behind him. A deer. A big one. He'd come back. Eliza ran to him. He was shaking violently, his face red and raw from the cold. His hands were so stiff he could barely hold on to the rope he'd used to drag the deer. I told you I'd come back, he said through chattering teeth. You're an idiot, Eliza said, pulling him toward the stove. Probably. You could have died. But I didn't. She wanted to hit him. She wanted to scream at him for being so reckless, so stupid, so willing to risk everything for food they'd ended up not even needing because the community had come through. Instead, she wrapped her arms around him and held on tight while he thawed out by the fire. Don't ever do that again, she whispered. Can't promise that. Rowan, can't promise I won't do whatever it takes to help you, he said quietly. Because I will. Every time. Eliza pulled back to look at him. His eyes were serious, searching hers for something. Why? She asked. You really don't know? She shook her head. Rowan smiled, tired, half frozen, but genuine. Because you matter, Eliza. What you're building here matters. And He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. I want to be part of it, part of what you're doing, not because of some debt to your father, because of you. The dining room had gone quiet around them. People were watching, but Eliza didn't care. I can't pay you, she said. I know. I don't know what I'm doing half the time. I know that too. I'm probably going to run this place into the ground. Maybe. His smile widened. But it'll be one hell of a ride getting there. Eliza laughed despite herself. You're impossible. Look who's talking. Someone started clapping, then others joined in. Soon the whole dining room was applauding, and Eliza realized they weren't just celebrating Rowan's return. They were celebrating what all of them had built together. The storm broke that night. By morning, the wind had died and the snow had stopped. The sun came out for the first time in days, turning the white landscape into something almost beautiful. The town began to dig itself out, and Eliza looked around her dining room, full of people eating food they'd shared, warmed by a fire they'd helped maintain, sheltered in a building they'd helped save, and felt something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. Real, solid, earned hope. The kind that didn't come from wishes or luck, but from work and sacrifice and people choosing to take care of each other when it mattered most. Spring came slowly to Red Hollow, revealing a town that looked different than it had the previous fall. The snow melted in uneven patches, exposing streets scarred with ruts and debris. Buildings that had seemed merely shabby before winter now looked skeletal, their paint peeled away by months of harsh weather. Several homes stood empty, their owners having left during the worst of it, unable or unwilling to endure another season of struggle. But there were signs of life too. Gardens being turned over, fences being mended, people moving with purpose instead of just survival. And at the center of it all, thorns. The dining house had become something of a landmark now. Travelers didn't just stop there because it was convenient, they sought it out specifically. The word had spread along the routes that salesmen and drifters traveled. There was a place in Red Hollow where you could get an honest meal and a clean bed, run by a woman who didn't cheat you and didn't judge. Eliza found herself serving breakfast to people she'd never seen before almost every morning now. They'd ask about the town, about the rooms, about her. She'd answer politely while serving eggs and coffee, then watch them leave with a mixture of satisfaction and exhaustion. The money was better now. Not good, but better. She'd been able to pay back most of what she owed Rowan, though he kept insisting she didn't need to rush. She'd even started paying down some of the larger debts in her ledger. The people who'd given food during the blizzard, the ones who'd donated labor or materials. Henry Sutton had refused payment entirely. Keep it, he'd said when she'd tried to give him money for the ham he'd contributed. Put it towards something useful. This is useful. It's paying back what I owe. You don't owe me anything. Henry had leaned against the counter, his weathered face serious. What you did during that storm, keeping this place open, feeding people when you had nothing yourself, that was worth more than a ham. Don't insult me by trying to turn it into a transaction. Eliza had learned not to argue with Henry when he got like that. She'd simply nodded and marked his debt as paid in the ledger anyway, even if no money had changed hands. The spring also brought new challenges. The roof started leaking in places they thought were patched. The stove developed a crack that sent smoke into the kitchen until Rowan could seal it properly. One of the upstairs rooms had a window frame that rotted through, requiring a complete replacement. There was always something breaking, always something that needed fixing, always something demanding attention and resources. But there were victories too. In April, Eliza hired her first employee. Sarah Brennan had been coming to Thorns almost every day anyway, helping clean, organize, and occasionally serve food when Eliza was overwhelmed. The baby was bigger now, more settled, and Sarah needed work. I can't pay much, Eliza warned her. Maybe $3 a week to start. That's $3 more than I have now, Sarah had replied. When do I start? Having help changed everything. Eliza could focus on cooking while Sarah handled the dining room. Sarah could watch the front while Eliza dealt with the rooms upstairs. They worked together smoothly, developing a rhythm that made the operation feel less chaotic. The baby, a girl named Emma, became a fixture in the dining room. Customers would coo over her, and the old-timers would tell Sarah stories about their own children while she worked. The presence of a baby somehow made the place feel more like home, more welcoming. Rowan noticed the change immediately. You look less like you're about to collapse, he observed one evening after the dinner rush. That's romantic, Eliza said dryly, scrubbing down the counter. I'm serious. You've been running yourself into the ground for months. It's good to see you with help. Sarah's been incredible. I should have hired someone sooner. You couldn't afford to hire someone sooner. Fair point. Rowan set down the table he'd been repairing and looked at her carefully. Can you afford it now? Eliza considered the question honestly. The rooms were bringing in steady income. The dining room was covering its costs and then some. She had a small cushion now, not much, but enough that an unexpected expense wouldn't destroy her. Barely, she admitted. But yes, I think so. Good. Rowan picked up his tools. Because I've been thinking about something. What? Expanding the rooms. We've got space for 2 more upstairs. Maybe 3 if we're creative with the layout. Eliza's first instinct was to refuse. More expansion meant more debt, more risk, more things that could go wrong. But she'd learned to listen when Rowan suggested something. He had good instincts for this kind of work. How much? She asked. $50? Maybe $60? We can do most of the labor ourselves again. The main cost is materials. $50. She had $32 saved right now, more money than she'd ever had at one time in her life. The idea of spending it all on more rooms made her stomach tight with anxiety. But the existing rooms were full almost every night now. She'd had to turn people away twice last week because she had no space. "Let me think about it," she said. "Take your time. Just know the offer stands." That night, Eliza sat with her ledger and did calculations until her eyes hurt. If the new rooms filled at the same rate as the existing ones, they'd pay for themselves in about 4 months. That was assuming nothing went catastrophically wrong, which felt like a dangerous assumption given her track record. But if she didn't expand, she'd be turning away income. People who might have stayed would go to the hotel instead or leave town entirely. She made the decision the next morning. "Let's do it," she told Rowan. 3 more rooms." His face broke into a genuine smile. "Yeah?" "Yeah, but we do it smart. We spread the cost out, buy materials in stages, and we don't start the next room until the previous one is done." Agreed. They shook on it like business partners, and something about that simple gesture felt significant. This wasn't just Rowan helping her out of obligation anymore. This was a partnership. The expansion took most of the spring and early summer. They'd work in the mornings before the dining room got busy, then again in the evenings after things quieted down. Slow, steady progress that didn't interfere with the daily operations. Sarah proved invaluable during this time. She managed the dining room like she'd been doing it for years, freeing Eliza to focus on construction. She learned the regular customers' preferences, remembered their names, made them feel welcome in ways that Eliza, who was naturally more reserved, struggled with. "You're better at this than I am," Eliza told her one afternoon, watching Sarah laugh with a table of travelers. "I'm better at talking to people," Sarah corrected. "You're better at everything else. That's why this works." By June, the first new room was finished. By July, the second. The third took longer. They'd run into structural issues that required extra support beams. But by August, all 3 were complete and rented out. Thorne's now had 5 guest rooms, a dining room that served 3 meals a day, and a reputation that extended well beyond Red Hollow's borders. People came specifically to stay there. Salesmen recommended it to each other. Families traveling west would plan their routes to include a stop in Red Hollow just to eat at Thorne's. The money was actually good now. Not wealthy person good, but sustainable. Eliza could pay her bills, pay Sarah a fair wage, buy quality ingredients, make repairs when needed, and still have something left over to save. She'd done it. Built something from nothing. Turned a cursed, burned-out shell into a thriving business. She should have felt triumphant. Instead, she felt watched. It started small. Comments from people she didn't know well. Looks that lasted a bit too long. Conversations that stopped when she walked by. Then Margaret Wells came by one afternoon in late August. "We need to talk," Margaret said, without preamble. Eliza was in the kitchen making bread. She wiped flour from her hands and gestured to a chair. "What about?" "About the fact that you're killing my business." Eliza blinked. "What?" "My hotel, my dining room. They're empty, Eliza. Have been for months. Everyone comes here instead." Margaret's voice wasn't angry exactly, but it was strained. "I've lost half my revenue since you opened this place. I'm sorry, but I'm not trying to... I know you're not trying to hurt me. That's almost worse." Margaret sat down heavily. "You're just doing what you do, and it happens to be better than what I do. More authentic, more real." Eliza didn't know what to say to that. "I'm not asking you to close," Margaret continued. "I'm asking you to understand that your success has consequences for other people. Some of us are struggling because you're thriving. The hotel was here first," Eliza said carefully. "You have history, reputation." "Had history, past tense." Margaret looked tired. "The truth is, people don't want fancy anymore. They want what you're offering, community, honesty, a place that feels like it cares about them. Your hotel is beautiful, the rooms are nicer, the location is better, and it's empty." Margaret stood. "I'm not here to make you feel guilty. I'm here to warn you. There are people in this town who aren't happy about what you've built, people who feel threatened by it. Be careful." She left before Eliza could ask what she meant. The warning proved prescient. A week later, a man named Douglas Whitmore arrived in Red Hollow. He was from the East, Boston, according to the rumors, and he'd come with money and plans. He bought the old grain warehouse at the edge of town and started renovating it. Word spread quickly about what he was building, a luxury hotel. 3 stories, 20 rooms, a dining hall with crystal chandeliers and imported furniture. He's going to put you out of business, Henry said bluntly when they heard the news. Eliza was serving lunch. She set down the pot she was carrying. How do you know? Because that's what men like Whitmore do. They see something successful and they want to own it. And when they can't own it, they destroy it. That's a bit dramatic. Is it? Henry leaned forward. You've built something here, Eliza. Something that matters. That makes you a target for people who measure success in dollars and don't give a damn about anything else. Eliza wanted to dismiss it as paranoia, but she couldn't shake the feeling that Henry was right. She met Douglas Whitmore 2 weeks later when he came into Thorne's for dinner. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe 40, with prematurely gray hair and expensive clothes that looked absurd in Red Hollow's dusty streets. He sat at a corner table and ordered soup. Eliza served him herself, curious about the man everyone was talking about. "Miss Thorne," he said pleasantly, "I've heard a great deal about you." "Have you? All good things, I assure you." He tasted the soup and nodded appreciatively. "This is excellent. Simple, but well executed." "Thank you." "I wanted to meet the woman who's captured this town's heart." Whitmore set down his spoon and looked at her directly. "I'm opening a hotel, as you've probably heard. I wanted to extend an offer before we become competitors." "What kind of offer?" "Sell me this place. I'll pay you a fair price. Well above what you paid for it, I'm sure. You walk away with money in your pocket. I acquire a property with built-in goodwill. Everyone wins." Eliza stared at him. "This isn't for sale." "Everything's for sale at the right price, Miss Thorne. Not this." Whitmore smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I respect your attachment to the place, but let me be frank. My hotel will open in 3 months. It will offer everything you offer and more. Better rooms, better food, better service. When that happens, your customers will leave. This is your chance to exit with dignity and profit." "I'll take my chances," Eliza said evenly. "That's unfortunate." Whitmore stood, leaving money on the table for the soup he'd barely touched. "I hope you don't come to regret that decision." He left. Eliza stood there, her hands trembling slightly with anger and something that felt uncomfortably like fear. Rowan appeared from the kitchen. "I heard that." "He wants to buy me out." "Of course he does. It's cheaper than competing." "I'm not selling." "I know." Rowan moved to stand beside her. "But he's right about one thing. When that hotel opens, things are going to get harder." "So what do I do?" "You do what you've always done. You keep going. You don't try to compete on his terms, fancy rooms and crystal chandeliers. You compete on your terms." "Which are?" Rowan gestured around the dining room. "This. The community you've built. The trust you've earned. He can't buy that no matter how much money he has." Eliza wanted to believe him, but doubt gnawed at her. She'd survived winter, survived fire, survived nearly starving. But this felt different. This was someone actively trying to destroy what she'd built, and he had resources she couldn't match. The next 3 months were tense. Whitmore's hotel went up fast, faster than seemed possible. He'd brought in workers from other towns, paying wages that pulled some of Red Hollow's able-bodied men away from their regular work. The building transformed from an empty warehouse into an imposing structure that dominated the skyline. People talked about it constantly. Some were excited. A luxury hotel meant Red Hollow was becoming a real town again, a destination. Others were worried. What would happen to the local businesses when Whitmore undercut their prices? Eliza tried not to think about it. She focused on what she could control, keeping her rooms clean, her food good, her prices fair. But she couldn't help noticing that some of her regular customers were talking about trying the new hotel when it opened, just to see what it was like, just to experience something different. Sarah noticed her anxiety. "Stop worrying about Whitmore," she said one afternoon while they were preparing dinner. "You're making yourself sick." "I can't help it. What if everyone leaves when his place opens?" "Then we'll deal with it, but I don't think they will." "Why not?" Sarah paused in her shopping to look at Eliza directly. "Because this place isn't just about the rooms or the food. It's about what happened here during the winter. When people were starving and you fed them, when the blizzard hit and you kept the doors open, when you gave people a place to belong." She went back to chopping. Whitmore can build a fancy hotel, but he can't build that. And people remember. Eliza hoped she was right. The hotel opened on a Friday in November with considerable fanfare. Whitmore had hired a band. There was free food and drinks. Half the town showed up just to see the inside. Eliza didn't go. She stayed at Thorne's, serving dinner to the customers who'd chosen to come there instead. They were fewer than usual, maybe half her normal crowd, and she tried not to let it hurt. Rowan ate at the counter, watching her work. "It's just the novelty," he said. "Give it a week." "You don't know that." "Actually, I do. I've seen this before. Rich guy comes in, makes a big splash, everyone's excited for a minute, then reality sets in." "What reality?" "That most people in this town can't afford luxury, and the ones who can don't stay in Red Hollow long enough to care." Eliza wanted to believe him. The first week after the hotel opened was brutal. Her room sat half empty. The dining room was quieter than it had been in months. Revenue dropped sharply. The second week was worse. By the third week, Eliza was starting to panic. She'd gone from comfortably sustainable to barely breaking even. If this continued, she'd be in serious trouble by the new year. She was considering cutting Sarah's wages, something she desperately didn't want to do, when Henry Sutton came in with news. "Whitmore's charging $2 a night for rooms," he said without preamble. Eliza blinked. $2? That's 4 times what I charge. "I know. And his dining room charges 50 cents for a basic meal." "That's insane. Nobody in Red Hollow can afford that." "Exactly." Henry sat down at the counter. "He's not targeting locals, he's targeting wealthy travelers. People passing through who want luxury and don't care what it costs." "So he's not really competing with me at all." "Not directly, but he's pulling away some of your customer base, the travelers who can afford more and want to feel fancy." Eliza thought about that. She'd been so worried about Whitmore stealing everything that she hadn't stopped to think about what he was actually doing. He wasn't trying to be Thorne's. He was trying to be something entirely different. "What should I do?" she asked. Henry smiled. "Exactly what you're doing. Keep your prices fair, keep your food honest, keep being the place where regular people feel welcome. Let Whitmore have the rich folks. You've got everyone else." It was simple advice, but it steadied her. Over the next few weeks, something interesting happened. The initial rush to Whitmore's hotel died down. Some people went once out of curiosity and never returned. Others found the prices prohibitive. A few loved it and became regulars, but they were mostly traveling businessmen and the occasional wealthy family passing through. Meanwhile, Thorne's customer base stabilized. The locals came back. The working-class travelers returned. The rooms filled up again, maybe not quite as full as before, but close. By December, Eliza realized something. She and Whitmore weren't actually competing. They were serving different markets, different needs, different types of people. She could live with that. What she couldn't live with was what Whitmore did next. It started with small things. Suppliers suddenly raising prices, but only for her, not for Whitmore. Deliveries being delayed or arriving with damaged goods. Travelers being told at the train station that Thorne's was closed or dirty or unsafe. Eliza couldn't prove Whitmore was behind it, but the timing was too convenient to be coincidence. Then came the inspection. A man claiming to be a county health inspector showed up one morning, demanding to examine her kitchen. He found violations everywhere, things that were either completely fabricated or so minor that no reasonable person would care. "This establishment is unsanitary," he declared after an hour of scrutinizing every corner. "I'm shutting you down pending corrections." "What corrections?" Eliza demanded. "Everything you've cited is either wrong or trivial. Take it up with the county office." He posted a notice on her door. "Closed by order of health department." Eliza stood there staring at it, rage and disbelief warring in her chest. Rowan came out from the kitchen. "This is Whitmore." "You don't know that." "Don't I? A health inspector who's never come to Red Hollow before suddenly shows up the same month Whitmore's trying to drive you out of business? Come on, Eliza." She knew he was right. She just didn't want to admit that someone could be that vindictive, that cruel. "What do I do?" she asked quietly. "You fight." The next week was hell. Eliza couldn't serve food with the closure notice posted, which meant no income from the dining room. The rooms stayed open, but without the dining component, travelers went elsewhere. She spent days going through every ridiculous citation the inspector had made, documenting how each one was wrong or unreasonable. She wrote letters to the county. She asked Henry and others to write testimonials about the cleanliness and quality of her establishment. Nothing moved quickly enough. Meanwhile, Whitmore's hotel thrived. He'd started offering special rates to undercut her room prices, apparently willing to lose money in the short term to drive her out entirely. Sarah came to her one evening after they'd closed. "I can work without pay for a while," she said, "until this gets sorted out." "No," Eliza said immediately. "You have a baby. You need that money. And you need help. We're in this together." Eliza felt tears threatening. "I can't ask you to do that." "You're not asking. I'm offering." Sarah's voice was firm. "You kept this place open when you had nothing. You fed me when I was starving. You gave me a job when I was desperate. You think I'm going to abandon you now because some rich bastard is playing dirty? Sarah, no. We stick together. That's what we do here." And she did. Sarah kept showing up, kept working, kept helping even without pay. So did Rowan, who'd long since fulfilled any obligation to her father but stayed anyway. Other people helped too. Henry brought food from his store at cost. Jack Reeves did small repairs for free. People who'd eaten in her dining room during the winter came by with messages of support, with offers to testify on her behalf, with whatever they could spare. The community she'd built was holding her up when she couldn't stand alone. 3 weeks after the closure notice was posted, Eliza got a letter from the county. The citations had been reviewed and found to be improperly issued. The inspector had been reprimanded. She was cleared to reopen immediately. She posted the clearance letter right over Whitmore's bogus closure notice and opened for breakfast the next morning. The dining room was packed. People had been waiting for this. They came to celebrate, to show support, to thumb their noses at Whitmore's attempted sabotage. Eliza served them all with tears in her eyes and gratitude in her throat. That afternoon, Whitmore himself appeared. "Congratulations on your reopening," he said, his smile not reaching his eyes. "Get out," Eliza said flatly. "I just wanted to extend an olive branch." "Get out." She stepped closer to him. "I know what you did. The inspector, the suppliers, the rumors, all of it." "I have no idea what you're talking about." "Yes, you do. And here's what's going to happen now. You're going to run your hotel, and I'm going to run mine. You're going to stay out of my way, and I'll stay out of yours. But if you ever try something like this again, I will make it my life's mission to destroy you. Do you understand me?" Whitmore's smile finally faded. "Is that a threat?" "It's a promise. Now get out of my establishment." He left, but not before giving her a look that promised this wasn't over. Eliza didn't care. She was done being afraid of him. That night, as she was closing up, Rowan spoke. "You handled that well. I'm tired of being pushed around." "I noticed." He smiled. "It's good to see you fighting back." "I should have done it sooner." "Maybe, but you did it when it mattered." He paused, seeming to consider his next words carefully. "I'm proud of you, Eliza." She looked at him, really looked at him. He'd been there from almost the beginning, building, helping, standing beside her through everything. Never asking for credit, never demanding recognition, just there. "Why are you still here, Rowan?" she asked quietly. "And don't say it's about my father's debt. That's been paid 10 times over." He met her eyes. "Because there's nowhere else I'd rather be." "That's not an answer." "Yes, it is." He moved closer. "I'm here because you're here. Because watching you build this place, watching you fight for it, watching you become someone who can stare down a man like Whitmore and not blink, that means something to me. You mean something to me." Eliza's breath caught. "I'm not good with words," Rowan continued, "and I don't know how to say this right, but somewhere between the first day I helped you pull boards and today, this stopped being about an old debt. It became about building a life. With you. Rowan, you don't have to say anything. I just wanted you to know." But Eliza did want to say something. She'd been so focused on survival, on the business, on fighting one crisis after another that she hadn't let herself think about what was growing between them. She thought about it now, about the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching, about how he always showed up when she needed him, about the quiet partnership they'd built that went deeper than business. "I'm not easy to be with," she said finally. "I'm stubborn and I work too much and I don't know how to ask for help." "I know. And I'll probably drive you crazy. You already do." Despite everything, she smiled. "So why would you want this?" Rowan reached out and took her hand. His palm was calloused and warm. Because you're worth it. All of it. The stubbornness, the crazy hours, the fights with rich bastards trying to shut you down. You're worth it. Eliza looked down at their joined hands, then back up at his face. Okay, she said. Okay? Okay, let's build a life. Together. Rowan's smile was like sunrise. He pulled her close and kissed her, and Eliza let herself fall into it, into him, into the possibility of something beyond just survival. When they finally pulled apart, he said, "Does this mean you'll finally let me move out of the room I'm renting from you?" Eliza laughed. "You've been renting a room here? For the last 4 months. You really didn't notice?" "I've been a bit distracted." Clearly, he kissed her again, softer this time. "I love you, Eliza Thorne." "I love you too," she said, and realized it was true. Had been true for a while, probably. She'd just been too busy fighting to notice. Outside, Red Hollow settled into night. Snow was starting to fall again, the first of the season. But inside Thorne's there was warmth and light, and the beginning of something new. Something that wasn't just about surviving, but about living. The years that followed weren't easy, but they were good. That distinction mattered more than Eliza had ever expected it would. Rowan moved his things out of the rented room and into hers. A practical decision that became something more when they stood together in the small space and realized this was theirs now. Not just a room, but a home. He'd brought almost nothing with him. Some clothes, a few tools, a book so worn the spine had split. Everything he owned fit in a single crate, and somehow that felt right. They were building from scratch together, the way they'd built everything else. Thorns continued to grow, but not in the explosive way Eliza had once feared and hoped for. It grew steadily, organically, like something alive that knew its own pace. By the second spring after Whitmore's hotel opened, they'd added 2 more rooms, smaller ones tucked into what had been storage space. They weren't fancy, but they were clean and warm, and people who stayed there left satisfied. The dining room expanded its hours. Sarah suggested serving supper on Sundays, and it became popular with families who didn't want to cook on their day of rest. Eliza hired a second helper, a young man named Thomas, who'd lost his job at the lumber mill when it closed. He was clumsy at first, breaking dishes and burning himself on the stove, but he learned fast and worked hard. The ledger of debts got shorter. Some people paid back what they owed in full. Others paid in installments. $1 here, 50 cents there. A few never paid at all, and Eliza stopped chasing them. She'd learned that some debts weren't meant to be collected in currency. The man who'd given her a silver dollar during the blizzard had died that winter, and his widow had nothing to give. Eliza marked his debt paid anyway, and served the widow free meals until she got back on her feet. Whitmore's hotel stayed open, but it never achieved the dominance he'd clearly expected. He catered to a specific clientele, wealthy travelers who wanted luxury and were willing to pay for it. There was a market for that, just not a large one in Red Hollow. Most of the town still came to Thorne's, and most travelers chose affordability over opulence. The two establishments existed in an uneasy truce. Whitmore stopped actively trying to sabotage Eliza's business, though she suspected that had more to do with his failed attempt than any moral epiphany. They'd see each other occasionally on the street and nod with cold civility, nothing more. Eliza learned to live with that. Not everything needed to be resolved with friendship or forgiveness. Sometimes 2 people just stayed out of each other's way, and that was enough. What surprised her more was Margaret Wells. The hotel owner had struggled for a while, caught between Whitmore's luxury prices and Thorne's community appeal. She'd come close to closing entirely, but in the end she'd found her niche, hosting events, weddings, business meetings, town gatherings. Her elegant dining room and established reputation made her the natural choice for occasions that required formality. She and Eliza developed an unexpected alliance. When Margaret had more guests than rooms, she'd send the overflow to Thorne's. When Eliza needed a fancier venue for something, she'd suggest Margaret's hotel. They weren't friends exactly, but they were colleagues who recognized that helping each other helped everyone. "You changed this town," Margaret told Eliza one afternoon when she stopped by for coffee. "When you first opened this place, I thought you were going to ruin us all. Turns out you saved us instead." "I didn't save anyone," Eliza said. "I just fed people." "That's the same thing. You just don't see it yet." Eliza wasn't sure she agreed, but she was learning to accept compliments without arguing. It was harder than it sounded. The town itself changed too. The train started coming through 3 times a week instead of 2. New businesses opened, a proper dry goods store, a telegraph office, even a small newspaper that published once a week. Red Hollow wasn't dying anymore. It was transforming into something sustainable, something with a future. People credited different things for the revival. The train schedule, Whitmore's hotel attracting attention, the lumber mill reopening under new ownership. But Henry Sutton had his own theory. "It's you," he told Eliza one evening while sitting at his usual spot at the counter. "You proved people could build something here, make something that mattered. Before you, everyone was just waiting for this town to die. You showed them it didn't have to." "I just wanted a place of my own," Eliza said. "And you got it. But you gave everyone else permission to want things too, to fight for them, to believe they were possible." Henry finished his coffee. "Don't underestimate what that means." Eliza thought about that conversation often in the months that followed. She'd never set out to inspire anyone or change anything beyond her own circumstances. But maybe that was the point. Maybe the most powerful thing you could do was simply refuse to accept that your life had to be small, limited, defined by other people's expectations. She'd been the girl they laughed at, the woman they dismissed, the fool who bought a cursed building and tried to make something of it, and she'd succeeded anyway. Not because she was special or chosen or blessed with advantages, but because she'd been too stubborn to quit when quitting would have been easier. Rowan saw it differently. "You succeeded because you cared," he said one night as they lay in bed, the sounds of the town settling around them. "About the food, about the people, about doing things right. That matters more than stubbornness." "I don't know if I'm good at caring," Eliza admitted. "I'm not warm like Sarah. I don't know how to make people feel comfortable with small talk." "No, but you make them feel safe. You make them feel like they matter. That's better than small talk." "Is it enough?" "Look around tomorrow and tell me if it's enough." She did look, and what she saw was a dining room full of people who chose to be there. Not because Thorns was the only option. It wasn't anymore. But because they wanted to be. Because the food was good and honest. Because the prices were fair. Because when they walked through that door, they knew they'd be treated with respect regardless of how much money they had or what kind of day they'd been having. That was what she'd built. Not just a business, but a place where people belonged. The breakthrough came in an unexpected form. A woman arrived in early summer, traveling alone, which was unusual enough to attract attention. She was maybe 60, well-dressed but not ostentatious, with sharp eyes that seemed to notice everything. She took a room for 3 nights and spent her days walking around town, talking to people, taking notes in a small leather journal. On her last evening, she came down to the dining room and asked to speak with Eliza. "My name is Catherine Morse," she said, extending her hand. "I write for the Western Chronicle. I'm doing a series on frontier towns that are finding new life after the railroad expansion." Eliza shook her hand cautiously. "And you're interested in Red Hollow?" "I'm interested in you." Catherine pulled out her journal. "I've spent 3 days talking to people in this town. Do you know what they all say when I ask them why Red Hollow survived when so many other towns didn't?" "The railroad? They say your name." Catherine smiled. "They tell me about a woman who bought a burned-out building everyone said was cursed, who fed people during a winter that should have killed half the town, who built something from nothing and refused to give up when powerful men tried to destroy her." Eliza felt her face heating. "They're exaggerating." "Are they?" "Because the facts seem to support the story. 5 years ago, this building was a ruin. This town was dying. Now you're running a successful inn with 8 guest rooms, employing 4 people, serving maybe 100 meals a day. You've paid back nearly every debt you incurred. You've helped at least 24 people start or save their own businesses through loans and advice, and you've become the de facto center of this community." Catherine leaned forward. "That's not exaggeration. That's documentation. I had help. Rowan, Sarah, Henry, Margaret, and they all say you're the reason it worked. You were the catalyst." Catherine tapped her journal. "I want to write about you, about what you've built here. Would that be all right?" Eliza wanted to refuse. She didn't like attention, didn't want to be held up as some kind of example or inspiration. She was just trying to run her business and live her life. But she thought about what Henry had said, about giving people permission to want things, to fight for them. Maybe her story could do that for someone else. Someone sitting in another dying town wondering if it was possible to build something better. "All right," she said, but you tell the truth. Not some cleaned-up version where everything was easy or noble. The truth. Catherine smiled. I wouldn't have it any other way. The article ran 6 weeks later. Catherine sent Eliza a copy, and she read it in her room with Rowan looking over her shoulder. It was honest, just as she'd asked. It talked about the hunger, the fear, the moments when failure seemed certain. It mentioned the fire, the blizzard, Whitmore's sabotage. It didn't make Eliza sound like a hero. It made her sound like a person who'd been scared and struggling and fighting just to survive. But it also talked about what she'd created. The community meals, the pay-what-you-can system, the way she'd turned a place of business into a place of belonging. The final paragraph stuck with Eliza. Eliza Thorne didn't set out to save a town. She set out to save herself. But in doing so, in refusing to accept that her life had to be defined by poverty, loneliness, and other people's contempt, she showed an entire community what was possible when you stopped waiting for permission to matter. Red Hollow is alive today, not because of railroad schedules or economic factors, but because one woman decided that a cursed building and a dying town were worth fighting for. And in fighting for them, she proved that nothing is as cursed or as dead as we convince ourselves it is. Eliza set down the paper with shaking hands. You all right? Rowan asked. I don't know. It's strange seeing your life written down like that. Like it means something. It does mean something. Does it? She looked at him. I just did what I had to do. What anyone would have done. No, not anyone. Most people would have given up. You didn't. That's what makes it matter. Eliza wasn't sure she believed that, but she folded the article carefully and put it away. The response to Catherine's piece was immediate and overwhelming. Letters started arriving, dozens of them, from people across the country who'd read about Eliza's story in the Chronicle. Some were from other women running businesses, thanking her for proving it was possible. Some were from struggling towns asking for advice. Some were just people saying they'd been inspired, that reading about what she'd done had given them courage to try something they'd been too afraid to attempt. Eliza read every single one, even though it took weeks. She tried to respond to as many as she could, though she felt inadequate to the task. What advice could she give? She'd made it up as she went along, stumbling through every decision. But Rowan reminded her that maybe that was the advice, that you didn't need to have all the answers before you started. You just needed to start. The article brought something else, too. More business. People started coming to Red Hollow specifically to stay at Thorne's, to see the place they'd read about. Some were disappointed. They'd expected something grander, more dramatic. But most understood. They saw the simple rooms, the honest food, the community gathering in the dining room, and they got it. This wasn't about luxury. It was about something more fundamental. About people taking care of each other. About building something that mattered more than profit. By the following spring, Eliza had to make a decision. They were turning people away almost every night now. The demand exceeded what they could provide. She could expand again, buy the building next door, knock through the wall, add more rooms. It would take money, a lot of it, but she had that now. She'd saved enough over the years to make it possible. Or she could stay as they were. Keep things manageable, sustainable, focused. She talked it over with Rowan one evening after closing. What do you want to do? He asked. I don't know. Part of me wants to keep growing, build something even bigger. And the other part? Eliza looked around the dining room. 8 tables, worn but sturdy. Walls that had been charred and ruined now painted a warm cream color. Windows that let in light. A space that felt lived in, cared for, loved. The other part thinks this is enough, she said. That making it bigger might make it less personal, less what it is. Then don't expand. But we're turning people away. So let them go somewhere else. Margaret's place, Whitmore's hotel. Hell, maybe someone else will open another inn. Competition isn't bad. Rowan put his arm around her shoulders. You don't have to be everything to everyone, Eliza. You just have to be what you are. She leaned into him, thinking about that. She'd spent so long fighting to survive, to prove she could make this work, that she'd never stopped to ask what success actually looked like. Did it mean endless growth? More rooms, more revenue, more everything? Or did it mean building something sustainable that served its purpose well? I think we stay as we are, she said finally. 8 rooms, 3 meals a day, a place where people feel welcome. That's enough. You sure? Yeah, I'm sure. It was one of the best decisions she ever made. Staying small kept Thorns what it had always been, personal, authentic, a place where Eliza knew every guest's name and could make their favorite meal without asking. It meant she could still work alongside Sarah and Thomas instead of managing a large staff. It meant she and Rowan could have a life that wasn't consumed entirely by the business. They got married that fall. Nothing fancy, just a simple ceremony in the dining room with the people who mattered. Henry gave Eliza away. Sarah stood with her. Margaret came, and even a few of the traveling salesmen who'd become regulars over the years. Whitmore didn't come, but he sent a card. It said simply, "Congratulations." No signature, just those two words. Eliza tucked it away with Catherine's article and the letters from strangers. Small pieces of a larger story. The years continued to pass. Red Hollow grew into a proper town. Not large, but stable. The population leveled out around 800 people. Enough to support local businesses, schools, a church for those who wanted it, a town hall for community events. Thorns became an institution. The place you went for your first date, your anniversary dinner, your celebration after a hard-won success. The place you brought your out-of-town relatives to show them what Red Hollow was about. The place where you knew you'd always be welcome, no matter what. Sarah's daughter Emma grew up running through the dining room, helping clear tables as soon as she was tall enough to reach them. Thomas eventually saved enough to open his own small restaurant 2 towns over, using everything he'd learned from Eliza. Henry Sutton passed away peacefully in his sleep at 73, and Eliza closed the dining room for a day to honor him properly. Margaret Wells sold her hotel and moved east to be with her daughter, but not before sitting down with Eliza one last time. "I was wrong about you," Margaret said. "When you first came to town, I thought you were going to fail spectacularly. I'm glad I was wrong." "So am I," Eliza said. "You did something I never figured out how to do. You built a business with a soul. I built a business that made money. Yours was better. Yours had its place too, maybe, but yours changed people." Margaret smiled. "That's worth more." Whitmore's hotel eventually closed. The luxury market never materialized the way he'd hoped, and he moved on to other investments in other towns. The building sat empty for a year before a local family bought it and converted it into apartments. Eliza felt no particular triumph at his failure. He'd been an obstacle, but not the villain of her story. The real villain had been the belief that she couldn't succeed, that she wasn't worthy of success, that someone like her couldn't build something that mattered. She'd proven that belief wrong. That was victory enough. 10 years after she'd bought the Silver Bell, Eliza stood in the doorway of Thorns on a spring morning and looked out at Red Hollow. The town was awake, people moving through their daily routines, shops opening, children heading to school, the train pulling into the station right on schedule. A place that had been dying was alive. She couldn't take all the credit for that, but she'd played her part. Rowan came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "How strange life is. 10 years ago, I was eating scraps and sleeping in a room I could barely afford. I had $43 and a building nobody wanted. I was nobody. You were never nobody. I felt like nobody. That's close enough." She turned to face him. "Now I have this. All of this. How did that happen?" "You built it. We built it." "All right, we built it." He kissed her forehead. "What are you going to do with it?" Eliza thought about that question. What came next? They were stable, successful, respected. She could coast for the next 30 years, running Thorns exactly as it was. Or she could keep building. Not the business, that was right-sized now. But maybe other things. She'd been thinking about starting a fund to help other women start businesses, using the money she'd saved. She'd been thinking about working with the town to establish better housing for people who fell on hard times. She'd been thinking about all the ways she could use what she'd learned, what she'd built, to help others do the same. "I don't know yet," she told Rowan honestly, "but I'll figure it out." "We'll figure it out," he corrected. "We'll figure it out," she agreed. That afternoon, a young woman came into Thorns. She looked nervous, out of place, like she didn't quite believe she belonged there. Eliza recognized that look. She'd worn it herself once. "Can I help you?" she asked. The woman hesitated. "I heard someone told me you sometimes help people who are trying to start something." "What are you trying to start?" "A dress shop. I know how to sew, and I've saved a little money, but I don't know how to run a business. I don't know if I can do it." Eliza looked at this young woman, scared, hopeful, standing at the beginning of a journey that might succeed or fail, and saw herself a decade ago. "Sit down," she said. "Let's talk." They talked for 2 hours. Eliza shared what she'd learned about managing money, finding suppliers, dealing with customers, surviving when things went wrong. She didn't sugarcoat the difficulties, but she didn't exaggerate them either. And at the end, she told the young woman the most important thing she'd learned. You don't have to be perfect. You don't have to have all the answers. You just have to be willing to try and willing to keep going when it gets hard. Because it will get hard. But if you can push through that, if you can build something real and honest, people will recognize it. They'll support it. The young woman left with tears in her eyes and determination in her face. Eliza watched her go and felt something settle in her chest, a sense of completion maybe, or purpose. This was what she was building now. Not just a business, but a legacy. Not of money or property, but of possibility. Of showing people that they could matter, could build something meaningful, could refuse to accept the limitations others put on them. She'd been the girl they laughed at. Now she was the woman who'd proved them wrong. And in doing so, she'd given other people permission to prove them wrong too. That evening, as the sun set over Red Hollow and the dining room filled with the sounds of conversation and laughter, Eliza stood at the kitchen door and let herself feel proud. Not arrogant, not boastful, just proud. She'd done this. With help, yes. With luck at crucial moments, absolutely. With more fear and doubt and near failures than she liked to remember. But she'd done it. And the woman who'd bought a cursed building with $43 had become the woman who'd built a home for an entire community. Not because she was chosen or special or destined for it, but because she'd chosen herself, because she'd decided she was worth fighting for, even when nobody else believed it. That was the real story. Not rags to riches, not tragedy to triumph. Just a person deciding they mattered and refusing to accept anything less. Rowan found her there, tears running down her face, smiling. "Happy?" he asked. "Yeah," she said, "I really am." And she was. Not perfectly. Not without struggles still ahead. Not without hard days and difficult decisions and moments when she'd wonder if she was doing the right thing. But happy. Building a life that mattered. Surrounded by people she loved and who loved her back. The girl they'd laughed at had the last laugh after all. Not by becoming rich or powerful or famous, but by becoming herself fully and completely and building a life worth living in the process. That was enough. More than enough. It was everything.